Okay, so today is Java 3 lesson 2, and today we're going to be learning about static methods. So this is the general format for a static method, and I'll explain what it is exactly later. But you can see here that this is like a general formatting, an example of sorts. And the output, if called, and I'll also talk about that later, it would be A. So explanation. Static methods are usually placed outside of the second pair of brackets, but inside the first pair of brackets. So static methods are methods that you create where every time you call them in between the second pair of brackets, which is also called the main method. And you should start getting used to like something being called the main method and like something being called the main class, that kind of stuff. And so yeah, if you so that every time you call them in between the second pair of brackets, the code inside them runs. You can have as many static methods as you want. The previous example is a type of method that only runs but doesn't return. So these methods are usually used for doing things such as printing things or computing things. The purpose of using methods is to be able to store code in a reusable container where you can use the code as much as possible in a limited amount of space. So basically going back to this slide, how this works is that, this would go, I'm pretty sure I have an image of it, an example of where it would go later on in the lesson. But how this would work is that every single time you use this name, so these three are all keywords. So public, static, void, they're all keywords. But this print string, that part is the name, basically. So you can name this whatever you want as long as it goes with naming conventions. And of course, you always have to have parentheses, and then curly brackets, and then the inside here is what code would go. So any code that works in a regular program would work inside a method. And I've talked about methods before, and the methods we used before, like the string methods, for example, or like the math.random, those are all called methods, and those are methods that are already set into Java, basically. And these are type of methods that you can create yourselves. And yeah, I already went over this. So how to run methods. So I talked about calling methods before, and this is how to call methods. So this is an example of how to run a method. And this is using like the example before on the other slide. And so you can see right here goes the name of the method, parentheses, and then semicolon. So this is known as calling the method. Note that this code would go in the main method instead of on the same, instead of outside the main method. And so you can also use this code as many times in your program as you want, and it will run the code of the method however many times you called it. So methods can hold any type of code that doesn't generate errors or exceptions, and it'll still work the same as in a regular program. It's just a way of packaging things and stuff you want to run repetitively into one place, and so that you don't have to write so many code all the time, or like copy and paste code, which could lead to errors. So it's a way of being more efficient with your code. So example of what your program would look like. And so if you see here, this part you should recognize. So the public static void main, this part you should recognize, and you should recognize the public class, my class. And so just as a reminder, this is what you would call the main method since it has the word main. So that's how you recognize it. But then if you wanted to create a method, a static method, then you'd put it on right behind it, basically. You could also put it in front of it, but usually it goes after it. And so you can see here that it goes within the public class, but it's not inside the main method. So it's outside here. And so you can see here how if I have a method print string, and then I want to print A, whatever it's called, and then when I put it inside the main method here, print string, and parentheses, semicolon, it would print out A because it runs this method. So another type of method. Okay, so framework for methods at parameters. And this is an example of it. And you can see here, it's basically the same as before, except I have like inside the parentheses, I now have two sort of like variable things. So these are what we call parameters. And what this is that I'll explain later. I have like an explanation slide as well. But you can see here that I basically do the inside the method. It basically does the same thing except I add them together. And again, this is regular code, so you can put any code here that works in a regular program. So if you wanted to call the method, you would do something like this. And you can see here that I write some variables here. Well, not variables, but values here. And again, I'll explain it in a few seconds. And since if you ran it, then it would output A, B with these. Okay, so explanation. This is a type of method that accepts parameters. Parameters are data that are needed for a method to work because the method will use those data pieces inside of it. So parameters have to go between the parentheses of the method name, the parentheses after the method name. And notice that when you call these types of methods, you also have to include the parameters needed inside the parentheses. Like inside the parentheses that is after like the name when you call it. And like the other method, this method only does things like printing and computing. These methods can have any number of parameters, though they have to be separated by commas, and parameters don't have to all be of the same data type. And note that you can't enter more or less parameters than defined. The parameters that you enter don't have to be the same name as the ones defined in the method. And the names of the ones in the method is what you'll use to write code in the method. So going back to the other slide to like explain it more. So in this here, in this initial like main part of the method, inside the parentheses, we have a string A and then a string B. So that's basically just sort of, it's kind of like defining a variable for the method. And same way as you might define a variable for like a for loop, this is similar to it, except that you don't set a value to it right now. So this is basically saying that for this method, I want a parameter of one string that is named A and another string that is named B. And so since when you run this code, you're going to pass values in, and these are the values, then these act sort of like variables. And so when you write them in the method, write your code in the method, if you wanted to use the parameters, you would use these variable names. And these variable names would refer to whatever you entered here. And so same thing here. For these, you have to enter whatever the parameter is. So you can't, for example, if you wanted to change this A into a number value, then it would cause an error because you can't have a number where it's supposed to be a string. And same thing, if I only put one string instead of two strings, then it'll also cause an error. And if I put three strings, it'll also cause an error and that kind of stuff. And this still works the same as any regular code would. So it'd still print out AB. And so this is kind of like a more dynamic way to do stuff. So that you don't have to write manually what you want to print out, and you can like keep reusing this code. And explanation. It's a lot of information, but since a lot of the code in Java, it has a lot of exceptions and like stuff you have to do, and this information is just something that can help you along the way so that you don't have to question everything you do. So this information kind of just explains the finer details of methods. So another type of method, and this one's the last one. And so these are a framework of methods with return types. And this is the following. So what you notice here, what is the main difference here is that instead of the static void before here, it has an int here. And so I'll explain that in a second. So, and then you see here that there's still parameters here, and you still have the curly brackets and here. But notice that instead of the print statement I had before, I have a return here. And also I'll explain that in a second. So one way I had to use the method, it would be this. You can set it to a variable, and you can see here that you still pass parameters in. And it's still the same thing as always. You put the name and the parameters and the semicolon. So note that this is another way to use the method. This following is another way to use the method. And note that there is no extra semicolon after the call statement. And if you wanted to print out the result of this, then you can do system.println, print int, and then parameters. And just notice that there's no extra semicolon, where before you had to have an extra semicolon. Well, not extra semicolon, but you had to have a semicolon. And the output it printed with this would be 14. So an explanation. So this type of method returns a value, but it doesn't actually print anything automatically. And you can set the method call to a variable, like the example before, to save it. Making sure to set the variable to the correct data type. Or you could also print it out in the print statement. Know how the first part of the method is not the same as before, as I said before. And then void was replaced with a data type name. So this is how you would define a return type. These types of methods need a return type, and you would put whatever the supposed output's data type is there. And make sure to put the correct return type. You can also accept parameters, like with the other data type. The other type of method, but you don't have to. Parameters and return types can use any data type, even arrays. So what this means is that if you can go back here, so these types of methods, they're not like before where you can print stuff. You can still print stuff, but the main defining thing about these types of methods is the fact that it can return stuff. So how this works is that instead of the void here, you put a data type. And so whatever you turn here, then you would put the data type of that in right here. So for example, right now, this method prints an integer, right? So that's why you would put an int here, because when you're returning this, the output is an int. So that's why you put it here. And for example, if it was like the print string example before, and then I wanted to return this, then instead of an int here, I would put a string. I would put the name string. And so on and so forth. If you were to print a long or like a double, that kind of stuff, you would all place it over here. So it's not set in stone. You can put it to whatever data type you need. And the thing with this is that also note that there can only be one return statement in the method. So you can't have multiple, only one. And this just works as always. It's just that it has an extra a return, and then it doesn't print it out automatically. So that's why you have to save it into. So that's why you have to like save it into something or like print it out automatically. Not automatically, but you have to print it out in the main method, because if you just do it without this variable or without the print statement, then it wouldn't actually print out anything, and it still execute, but nothing would happen, basically. Again, this is an explanation. The methods was the same name. The following few slides are going to be like closing details. We already passed the kind of like the very important details. But if you have ever had a question with like methods with the same name, so it's possible to have methods with the same name, though they have to have different parameter types or different total number of parameters. So you can't have the two methods with the same name and parameters in one class. And classes will be explained later in detail. Actually, it'll be explained next class. So just look out for that. So you might not know what class means yet. So except for the public class, but I'm talking about other classes really. So I have an example of same name methods in like the next slide. So you can see here, if I had two methods here, and they're both named print string, and then I have a string A here and a string B here, and if you run this, it would cause an error, and Java would complain, and this is not allowed because you can have methods with the same name, except for the fact that these are both strings, and there's only one total parameter in both of them, and so they're too similar to really differentiate. So the reason why Java would complain is because if you called one of these, Java wouldn't know which one you're calling. And especially since if you had like the same data type and the same total number of parameters, it wouldn't know which one to call. So that's the reason why you have to differentiate between them. And this is an example of what is allowed. So you can see here that they still have the same name, print string, but over here I have string A, and over here I have int B. And this would be allowed because now Java can differentiate between the two. So even though the names are the same, Java can look at the parameters and match them. And since they're not the same, it can easily differentiate between the two depending on what number you enter or what value you enter. So yeah, this is allowed. Static variables. Static variables are variables that are visible to the whole class and the methods in it. And again, there's more about class later on in the course. And it means that it can be used anywhere in the class. So, for example, an implementation of it. So you can see here, public static int sum equals 5. So this static and this public has to be here. But this int you can change to whatever data type you want. And so it doesn't have to be int. So this can change. And this is the name of the variable. So of course you can change that. And this is the value. And it still has a semicolon. It's still basically the same formatting of regular variable. It just has the extra static in the public. And yeah, the int can change to another data type, and this variable is placed outside of the second pair of brackets, the main method, but inside the first pair of brackets, so the public method. Sorry, the public class. And it's used like a regular variable. So any way you use regular variables, you can use it. So for example, you can add two of these variables together and print it out and all that stuff. The only difference it has with regular variables is that it can be used in more places than regular variables can. And also, just a new type of exception. So a legal argument exception is an exception that occurs when a method has been passed with invalid parameters, such as a wrong data type or incorrect amount of parameters, etc. So like all other methods, you can test this exception in try and catch blocks and with throwing it. And you guys seen this exception before. I just didn't explain it back then since you probably wouldn't have known what it actually was. And yeah, that's all of the lesson today then. So we'll be doing class problems in a second then. Okay, so this is the class problems for this lesson. And so just make sure to do them so that you're familiar and comfortable with going on with next week's lesson. And so, yeah, so these are the class problems. And if there's any questions, comments, or concerns, you can put them in the section below. But otherwise, that would be it for this lesson today then.